Greeks treated other humans as property, and it was part and parcel of their lifetime. These miserable people worked in almost all spheres of society. Aristotle, one of the Greek intellectuals of that time, named these people as living property. Let us dig deep to know the diabolical history of the living property in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, slavery played an important role in society, or more accurately, the Greeks forced these slaves to do the activities and jobs that they were reluctant to do themselves. It wouldn't be wrong to say that the Greek economy was based on slavery. Slaves for the economy might be obtained from a variety of places. Some of the slaves were born free but were sold into slavery by their parents because they were too poor to care for them. Both men and women were sold by their tribes in return for food and other supplies. Not only that, the victorious army seized a significant number of slaves as prisoners of war. The archaeological evidence shows one such incident of Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father. After conquering Scythia, he sold 20,000 slaves, including women and children he had captured in the war. Most of the Greek slaves came from small Greek towns, while many others were brought in from Egypt and Persia. The practice of debt enslavement forced Athenians to become slaves. They had to become enslaved to the landlord either until the loan was completely repaid or something even for the unpaid rent to the landowner. Foreigners who had been kidnapped during wartime made up a large portion of the enslaved population. The sons of vanquished foes were enslaved and occasionally ended up serving the patrons of male brothels. Some were simply born slaves, consigned to a life of essential incarceration after inheriting slavery from their parents. Slaves were owned by citizens as their property and even by the state. The individuals could treat them as like and be allowed to take forced hard labor from them, whereas the public slaves owned by the state worked in less manual roles such as clerks. Some of them even worked in the construction of roads and temples. While many were also sent to work in quarries and mines, the most typical sort of job for those who were in slavery was in the agricultural industry. It may be argued that domestic slaves led less harsh lives. Some would travel with their masters, possibly becoming unofficial confidants. Many slaves also worked in professions such as banking, retail, or the arts. These slaves worked for their owners and were paid a commission even though they didn't live with their masters. Unsurprisingly, their lives would not be as difficult as those slaves who performed strenuous manual labor every day. In the 6th and 5th centuries BC, Athens may have had as many as 80,000 slaves, with a typical home owning 3 to 4 slaves. Only the poor households were without slaves. Ancient Athens' legal system regarded slaves as the property of their owners. Their master allowed them to buy, sell, and even beat them. Some were regarded as public slaves who belonged to the city-state and were therefore an elite category of slaves. Slave labor was the primary form of labor used in the classical era to produce crafts. Rich politicians owned the majority of the artisan factories. The duties of women slaves included performing all household chores and, in many cases, taking care of the family's young ones. Most of the slaves worked and lived with their owners. Female slaves are known to have worked in the wool industry and the retail industry, as well as providing wet nursing for newborns and working in craft stores. Additionally, female slaves served as concubines and brothel prostitutes. Concubines, on the other hand, had no rights at all. The concubine occasionally resided in the man's home along with his wife. Other times, she might be granted a separate home to live in with her kids. All slaves in the Spartan city-state belonged to the government. To set them apart from Spartan inhabitants, they were compelled to wear degrading clothing because they were considered enemies. They were referred to as helots by Spartans, a term that is still used in Greece today to characterize anyone who toils hard for little compensation and under unfavorable circumstances. Helots made up the whole foundation of the Spartan economy and were so crucial to food production that they outnumbered citizens by an incredible 20 to 1. These helots were treated like animals by the Spartans, who also forbade them from leaving the location where they worked. They were ceremoniously beaten in front of others to serve as a reminder of their subservient status. Even murdering a helot was not a crime. To demonstrate to the young Spartans the dangers of excessive drinking, Spartans even had their slaves drink. The worst aspect was that the young Spartan men were instructed to terrify the helots and keep them in subservience by running over the land with daggers in hand and killing them whenever they pleased. Slaves served as soldiers while at war, cleaning their armor, cooking, and occasionally acting as light infantrymen. Helots were allowed to create some sort of family unit, and Spartans encouraged them to reproduce amongst themselves to maintain their population. Helots were the product of selected breeding, much like Spartan citizens. The strong would survive while the weak would be expelled or possibly executed on the spot. Additionally, to increase the population of state servants, Spartans would procreate with helot women. The offspring that resulted would be known as Nathoi and had a status between a slave and a free man. Nathoi often participated in the citizen army or had a low-level position in the government. However, girls that were the product of a Spartan and a helot would just be thrown away. Slaves in their half-naked state, clutching wooden placards around their necks, were a common sight in Greek marketplaces. Every female and child got a wooden placard with all the necessary details about the slave on it. Name, age, and skills were all provided. Greek lords marketed the slaves they owned as prostitutes. They benefited from abusing their slaves physically and sexually. Slaves were used by their owners as sexual objects. A master might execute his slaves without a trial. They even had a team of trained executioners equipped with the required boards, ropes, shackles, nails, and other necessities. The slaves would be nailed to a cross after being stripped and flayed. Every time the slave tried to rise, the pain from his shattered legs would be severe. For their lords, urban slave women performed services including babysitting, hairstyling, bathing, and companionship. In rural areas, they served as maids, midwives, or kitchen assistants. Slaves who were female were forbidden from dating other slaves or caring for their progeny. The practice of having illicit relationships with masters was widespread, even though connubium, or legal marriage, was forbidden. Women typically worked in prostitution. Prostitutes typically lived in dreadful circumstances. They were forced into prostitution even before they reached puberty and suffered different sorts of verbal and physical abuse. Mines and quarries have some of the harshest working conditions. Long, dismal, and claustrophobic tunnels with no breaks. Just imagine their hardships. The work was very demanding and the tunnels frequently collapsed. Slaves were compelled to work day and night on the mining project. The terrible anguish they endured was the cause of many deaths. There wasn't a halt or break. They were also made to labor continuously while being thrashed by the overseers. Because of the extreme horrors they had to bear, these miners and agricultural workers chose death over life. Slaves who labored in mines or fields faced the toughest and most demanding lives. They would eat little, sleep in barn-like shelters, and have their feet bound. This limited their freedom of movement and acted as a continual reminder of their plight as captives. They were treated like consumer goods and forced to work until they died. These slaves had few options for liberation other than escaping. Their owners were afraid of their instinctive drive to flee. The slaves were restrained by collars around their necks made of etched metal. These metal collars were attached and welded to their necks, making it difficult for them to remove them. Such collars were used to prevent enslaved individuals from escaping and aid in their recapture, and had the master's name engraved on them. This was the diabolical history of the living property in ancient Greece. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked the video, check out other historical videos on our channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so that you don't miss out on such interesting topics.